Hey everyone, good to be with you again for our third installment here of the 10th quarter Sunday School Teachers Quarterly Intensive. And so I'm going to tease out a little bit of our theme on Messiah, touching on the third lesson of the first unit, coming from John 21, which is actually our last lesson as far as the gospel trek is concerned. Granted, you do see in the lesson below this, we do have a passage from Matthew to read next week, but by and large, this is going to be the end of our time in the Gospels, because once we finish this unit here and we move on to Unit 29, we're going to be transitioning over to the book of Acts. So just to prepare you for that. Now, while the lesson in the Gospel Project, our people are restored, and of course, if you are familiar with John 21, then you should recognize this is the passage in which Jesus is restoring Peter, unique to John's gospel in that regard. But a tentative title that I'm using is John and Chronicles, and both of them bring together perfect messianic endings. Now, I'm going to try my best not to make this overly complicated or convoluted in the short amount of time that I'm going to present this to you. And again, just like the lesson that came before this with respect to handling Thomas's doubt, I know that this definitely has a personal application to it, but I think it would also be helpful if we at least help our students understand that while there are always personal applications to potentially, they're not always there in every portion of Scripture, but potentially to be made with respect to where we are in any portion of the Bible, that our role as teachers is to help our students better understand how to appreciate the meta-narrative of Scripture so that they can then properly tease out what personal applications may be there without adulterating the text, okay? Without doing harm or violation to it, because now they're reading something into it that's not there, and that is preventable by us helping them understand, well, what's going on in the larger frame or context of Scripture itself, right? So with that in mind, what I share with you, I know you might not use, but perhaps you might find it condensable into a 5 to 10 minute little spiel, somewhere I would think probably better fitting at the beginning of your lesson time, and then maybe work more toward a personal application. I will admit honestly to you, that's probably what I will do, although this will encompass more of my time with my students and spend a little bit of time at the end teasing out a personal application, just to make sure that they're tracking, I guess, what I intend to unveil through this. So what you're seeing at the top and bottom of the screen with respect to these orange boxes are essentially the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles at the top and the book of John at the bottom. And what I mean by perfect messianic endings will become clear once we get to the green box at the top of the screen here and at the bottom of the screen here. So this will go rather quickly because a lot of it is rather repetitive. So understand that the writer of Chronicles, and I'm up here at the top of the screen in this orange box, is recapitulating Israel's history. And if you think about it, essentially John is doing the same. This is not different from what the other gospel writers are doing as well, albeit they might be using a different frame of reference for it, whether it's whole Bible concept with respect to Matthew and all of the Old Testament story. And mostly Luke is doing the same thing, albeit there's more of a centrifugal focus around the core concepts that are isolated in Isaiah, and Mark kind of more so on a 7-day creation week format with the mention of 7 individual evenings. Sometimes he will also go on to mention the day that follows after that. And I won't rehash that here and now. But John is really recapitulating Israel's history, and he's doing it with several major themes in mind with respect to Son of God, as goes the pre-incarnate one, the second member of the Trinity incarnated in human flesh. He's also doing this with the themes of temple in the background and whatnot. And so as he's retelling Israel's history, we understand more of what he intends for us to capture with respect to the end of his gospel, and how each of these particular signs or whatnot were serving to illustrate that Jesus is indeed God incarnated in flesh. And by virtue of that, if we believe and trust and follow him, we will have life. Well, when we go back and we evaluate the book of Chronicles, we have to appreciate this is a retelling of Israel's history, and it is in a time after the restoration to the land when the exile is over, which leads me to the second or the first blue box. The temple has already been built in the days of Ezra. If you go back and actually look at the arrangement of the Tanakh, Torah, and then of course the writings of the prophets, starting with Joshua, and then once you get through First and Second Kings, you actually transition over to Isaiah. First and Second Chronicles is not situated in the Hebrew compilation of what we call the Old Testament after First and Second Kings. And I think it, in large part, kind of does something of a disservice to us because we fail to appreciate then without being made aware of this just by reading that particular arrangement in our English Bibles. So that being said, if we look at the Jewish compilation of Scripture, as I've said before, we recognize that First and Second Chronicles actually ends the Old Testament for them. It comes in the third division of the Tanakh, and that is the writings. And the group of the writings starts with the Psalms and ends with First and Second Chronicles. So Ezra and Nehemiah actually is broken off. It does not come after First and Second Chronicles like it does in our English Bibles. Instead, it is also nestled in the writings, and it comes before First and Second Chronicles. So when you read the history of Israel in the Tanakh or Hebrew Old Testament, you have already read through the restoration accounts of Ezra and Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the temple. And with that, there is a tracking of a remnant here that starts with Ezra and Nehemiah with the groups of people who have come back and the numbers with them. So when you then transition away from Ezra and Nehemiah directly into First Chronicles, and that first 11 chapters is dedicated to a much lengthier genealogy, we understand we're tracking a remnant, and that remnant begins with Adam because that's where the genealogy starts, and then it moves sequentially down until we eventually arrive at Judah with David and his sons and the last Judite king that ruled before the exile. And this is setting Israel up not to embrace a post-exilic period to come, but to nestle them in the period they're already experiencing and to help them look forward to the arrival of Messiah, because the writer of Chronicles clearly understands, without having to say it in print, that Messiah has not come, and these people are still waiting for the fulfillment of many of these post-exile promises. Now, to track this in John, we see that while the temple was already rebuilt in the days of Ezra, when we look at John's gospel in John 1, verse 14, that this word has become flesh and tabernacled amongst us. We beheld his glory, looking back to the tabernacle in the wilderness. And of course, with chapter 2 and Jesus saying, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days, and many other key texts, John 7, 10, and so forth, that show us very clearly John has the temple concept in the foreground, and he's using Jesus as a way of illustrating the temple has been repurposed in him. There is also tracking of a remnant without mention of any sort of genealogy in John's gospel, if you think about it, because in John 1, he's starting with creation, much like the writer of Chronicles has begun his genealogy with Adam, which of course is in the creation story. But this remnant is being tracked from creation through Jesus, because in John 1, in his doxology, in those first 14 to 18 verses, we become very aware of the fact that all of creation is being distilled here in Jesus, who's now become God manifest in flesh. And Jesus is going to bring out this remnant from exile in the choosing of the 12, who will carry forth this renewed Israel with him as its renewed temple. And this brings us to our concept of Second Chronicles and John serving as a double ending. So what I mean by that is Ezra and Nehemiah, for the most part, would serve as a capstone to Israel's history. They've went through exile for 70 years. They've now come out. They've been restored to the land. They've rebuilt the temple and resurrected the form of worship, and they're waiting now for the remainder of these promises. So again, why the recapitulation of their history with Second Chronicles? Well, Second Chronicles is the second ending, if that's the case, or the double ending. And it's the promise that we're left with at the end, which I'll touch on in just a second. John is doing the same thing. John, according to Christian history and our canonical arrangement in Scripture, is telling yet again another story of Jesus here. But that's not what I mean by that when I say double ending. When we look at the arrangement of John 20 and 21, it's giving us this double ending concept. Let me explain it first through Chronicles, and then I think it will become alive for us in John. So go up with me to this green box at the top of the screen. We understand Nehemiah 12, the construction is finally over with. The temple's been built. Nehemiah goes back to help patch up the wall, which was started in the days of Zerubbabel and Joshua, and now comes to completion in Nehemiah's day. So as we've said before, Second Chronicles is written after the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And here, as you see on the screen, I'm pointing to this second set of red font. And so there comes another commission for the people to regather and rebuild the temple. This is where I would really want you to pay attention, okay? They have come together to rebuild the temple. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's not possible. If they've already built the temple and they've been regathered in the land, while there are still Jews in exile and will be for hundreds of years up until the time of Jesus, then what regathering is there a need of? I'm glad you asked. Again, the writer of Second Chronicles understands that the people are still scattered in dispersion, and they are still awaiting for the arrival of Messiah and ultimately the temple that God meant to be built, not the temple so much that, or I should say, not a physical temple that Ezekiel mentioned, and that this community of exiles that have come back into the land seem to have failed to understand that was supposed to be the temple that was built. Rather, an understanding of what Ezekiel was saying is that the temple that Messiah will build seemingly transcends any earthly temple. So the last statements of what the writer in Chronicles gives is the commission by Cyrus to leave the land of captivity and to go back and rebuild the temple. Notice the words here. The Lord, the God of the heavens, has given me, this is Cyrus, all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed me to build him a temple at Jerusalem in Judah. All of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord his God be with him. You may go up, and may the Lord his God be with him to build him a temple. It's a very weird ending for the writer of Chronicles to write this if that time has already come and gone. He could have found another ending for the work itself, or he could have went on to state, this is what Cyrus said, and by God's grace we have done this. But that's not what he says. He just leaves this as an rather inappropriate ending, if not for the purpose of saying, we still expect this to be fulfilled, though a temple stands amongst us. This commission is still yet for you, all of you who are in exile, who will read this in future generations to come when Messiah comes and brings the gathering of the people in full. So go to the bottom of the screen here. We see that John, in John chapter 20, has made this statement: Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. This is immediately after the account of Thomas's denial. And then, of course, Jesus coming to give him the proof he wants. And then by virtue of that, Thomas falls on his knees and adores Jesus, which is something of a bookend from the statement that Nathanael made at the beginning of the gospel when he speaks of Jesus as being the Son of God and the true King of Israel, and Thomas saying, my Lord and my God. Then we see that John 21 is essentially a repeat of John 20 regarding Jesus's acts and identity. We'll touch on that in just a second, but let me read this final statement. So what we'll see then in John 21, and this, of course, ties into the lesson that we're going to be talking about on this upcoming Sunday. A restored Peter is commissioned by the new temple, who, of course, is Jesus, to gather God's people together. So then when we hear Jesus or John say this in John 21, there are many other things that Jesus did, which if every one of them were written down, I suppose not even the world itself could contain the books that would be written. He says this after Peter has been asked by Jesus 3 times, do you love me? And answered 3 times, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus says, then go and feed my sheep or my lambs. What was the purpose of the restoration of Peter? You may say, well, I mean, it's a nice answer to the question that none of the other gospel writers seem to have captured. What happened to Peter? Well, we would clearly understand that from the book of Acts. And granted, there might still be a mystery there as to, well, how did we get from the moment when he denied Jesus to this moment here? And it makes us aware of the fact that Jesus did indeed restore Peter. But that wasn't the only reason for John putting that there as the end to his gospel with respect to all the major themes that John has had balanced out throughout the gospel. If we think that that is how he wants to end it, just by telling us, hey, and by the way, Peter actually was restored by Jesus as a tack on to the end of it, then we've misunderstood everything else that John had in store for us. And you would think that the end of John 20 would serve as a proper end then, if that were the case, if it was just to simply mention Peter's restoration, but it's not. This has always been the understood ending of John's gospel. So why the double statements? Why repeat what he's already said in John 20, that there's many other things that Jesus did, again, in John 21, and in between that, include the commissioning of Peter. If we've understood what John has been saying about Jesus, that he is this new temple, then this new temple has now commissioned the leader of the disciples to go back out. Essentially, that's what we're seeing is John or Peter has went back to fishing. He has almost left behind the call that Jesus gave him at the beginning of the gospel to fish for men and now go back and fish for literal fish. But Jesus has come to him and restored him to tell him, I'm not done with you, and this is not how it ends. Go. Just like the writer of Chronicles is telling the people of Israel as they read the history that he has included for them, this is not our end. We are awaiting for Messiah and the more perfect temple to come in. And so you are called to come back to this land and wait for it, because when that time of ingathering comes and Messiah arrives, then the temple that he promised will come with him. And this is essentially what John is telling us in his story. So I hope that's helpful. Hope it's not confusing. And of course, I do appreciate you listening, and more to follow in the future.